It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting. It's interesting.
Welcome to It's So Interesting, where people talk about their work and life experience. I am George Spitzer. I have with me today Hunter Freeman, a well-known advertising photographer. Welcome to the show.
Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Please tell me, what is the difference between a photographer and an advertising photographer?
Well, obviously, an advertising photographer is a photographer, but there are many different categories of photographers. There are photographers that shoot only sports. There are photographers that only shoot travel photography, travel all over the world. There are photographers who just shoot fashion and models or beauty. There are photographers that shoot only still life and things like that. As an advertising photographer, I deal, like many of those that I mentioned actually, deal with advertising agencies, and I shoot primarily product and people. Normally in my line of work, a photographer will specialize in one particular area, but just by virtue of the path I've taken, I've ended up doing a number of different things, and that's the best way to describe what I do, people and product.
I've seen some of your photographs over the years, both of your professional work as well as your fun work, and all of it's outstanding. A lot of it has got to do with the light. So tell me, it's an odd question, actually it's a pointed question. Why is your photography better than all the photography I've ever seen from anybody else?
Well, I think you're probably looking through the glasses of a friend. That is probably part of it. I wish that everybody out there felt the same way as you do. I'd certainly have an even busier career, but I can't say specifically. I love my job. I like the kind of work that I do. I like the work that I do that isn't really connected to my making a living as well. I don't know, I'm just, it's nice to know that it strikes some people more strongly than others.
Which brings up a point I'm also curious about, which is many roads or many twists and turns have led to your developing this talent. Do you believe you were born with it, you were trained, or you just did it 10,000 times?
I think practice is a real good thing. Practice does make perfect, but I don't think practice would make me Picasso. I think every endeavor, whether it's in the arts or engineering or writing, whatever, is extremely individual, and people learn and are attracted to things that interest them deeply. And the more interest they have, I think, the more their development comes, because they look not only, I think anyways, that they look not only at their own work in terms of its developing, but they look at it critically and go and ask themselves, how can I make this better? I think the best artists in the world, the best engineers, the best scientists are always in that frame of mind where they're not satisfied with what they've done and desire to do better. I feel it's true for me, which is not to say that I'm not lazy sometimes, but I think it's true for the best people that I know in this business and who are photographers, as well as other fields too.
I've thought about photography because I've always enjoyed looking at photos and realized that I can't even take a good photo, let alone one that's level. But aside from photography school, where you learn some technical things, which I presume you've done some of that in a long time ago, but are there other disciplines that you need to have a discipline such as physics, light, engineering, mechanical engineering?
Well, I think one of the ones you mentioned, light, plays obviously a major role in photography. But I think generally with anything, and I would dispute your ability to take a good picture, that's a mental roadblock and not anything that's inherent in you physically or mentally other than the roadblock, because my own feeling is that anybody can learn many of the things that are required to take a good picture. They may not become Ansel Adams or Richard Avedon, but they can become very good.
Or Hunter Freeman.
Well, I wish I were in that same category. But I think that the learning of those things comes from a realization that you can learn them, and the more effort you put into it, you can get there. And that's what I've tried to do. In terms of being born, like we mentioned earlier, you asked earlier, born with it or whatever, I think it really is that general sense of curiosity. And, I don't know if it's a particular talent that somebody may be born with, but if you could be born with one talent, I think it'd be wonderful to be born with curiosity, because that would drive you, in so many wonderful ways.
How can you apply curiosity to a product?
Oh, that's a good question. I like that. I think a lot of things, a lot of products over time, over history, have come about, I think, in probably a number of ways, one of which is it became possible to do something like the motion picture camera that Edison invented. There wasn't sort of a need for it, but he invented it, and all of a sudden there was a need for it. Or like the iPod or the iPhone. There wasn't a need for all these things that could happen, but boy, you know what? iTunes came along with all that as part of it, and look what's happened. The same with the light bulb. There was a specific need for light in people's homes that wasn't lit by gas, some kind of flammable liquid or vapor. And if there's a way to convey that via electricity, that would be terrific. That led Edison to try the proverbial 10,000 times until he found something that actually worked. I mean, talk about persistence. He would think that I'm an expert at creating a light bulb. 9,000 times later, so how good are you at inventing light bulb? Well, not so good. I know lots of ways not to make them.
When you were in high school, for example, did you know at the time you wanted to be a photographer?
No, I was definitely not looking to be a photographer. In high school, the first thing that I thought I wanted to be was an architect. I was into math and science my whole life. My dad was an electrical engineer. I remember as a little kid, I was definitely 6 or younger, playing with one of his oscilloscopes at home that he had brought home for some reason. It was just fascinating stuff. That was my life up through the middle of college, pretty much, in terms of what I thought I wanted to do.
So how did you fall into photography as a living? Were you pushed into it, or is this something you explored?
No, I discovered that this is what I wanted to do. Initially in college was a physics major and did not see that as a career that I wanted to be in. So I switched to math because most of the courses switched. Most of the physics courses were math. And then math was my major, which is the degree I got as well. But by the time I was end of my junior year, I knew I didn't want to be in that as a career either. I just didn't really know what I wanted to do. Over the summer, and then back in the fall of my senior year, a friend described the commercial advertising photography world from New York, his slight connection with it in terms of work and so forth over the summer. And I was exposed to a whole brand new world of photography that I didn't even know existed. I mean, it was all around me in terms of magazine ads and kind of thing, but I just really wasn't seeing it. But now I was, and I realized that this is what I could do. I could do this. This sounds fascinating. And that's when I knew. And so pretty much all my senior year was a matter of figuring out what I'm going to do after I get out of college to try and get into the world of advertising photography.
And your previous education, including high school, with the physics and the math, from your point of view, was a prerequisite to be part of your successful experience?
No, to use a really old phrase, I'd say not. It was helpful, but it wasn't a prerequisite. I would describe it with a really old saying that it was all grist for the mill. Basically, it was all helpful, but it wasn't something that was required. I've known people in this business, advertising photography, who've come from every kind of field you could think of, from writing to history to chemistry to almost anything you could think of. And these days, actually, people go right from high school into school and come out looking to be photographers, so they don't have a previous life or experience to draw from. They're developing it as they learn photography.
So lots of life experience is a good idea.
It all helps. I think really every career, I mean, as you I'm sure can tell, that you draw lessons and you learn things from everything you do. I've tried to. Not just, like my time first starting in New York. I learned a lot of things, and they weren't just about photography. I'm so appreciative and grateful for those things that changed my life.
Your thinking and your viewpoint and your training and your experience all add to your success. You're taking pictures of people, for advertisers or clients, and also their objects of whatever it is they're selling. What's the ratio of the two?
It's about equal. It's kind of funny because people in my line of work, as I said, generally specialize and do mostly one thing. There are people that do lifestyle photography and they hardly ever shoot photography or of product. And there are people that shoot product that hardly ever shoot people. But for whatever reasons, over the years, people have asked me to do both. Works okay for me and works okay for the clients that I work with. So
that is an unusual talent. It's certainly brought out the results for all to see.
Mm-hmm.
So you have your personal perspective, or I would say your mental perspective on things, and you try to bring out of the object or the person qualities that you see as a photographer that would like to share with others, and you use your camera to capture that. So is your style of photography got to do with what you sometimes see in the typical movie where a photographer runs around taking 5,000 snaps a second? Or do you stage shoot your shoots where you work for hours to set things up just right with the light and so forth, take a shot and that's it?
Well, it's I've generally been the kind of photographer who likes a lot of control for most things. One of the things I've learned over the years, especially in the last decade or so, couple of decades, is that having it not be so planned and organized can have its own benefits. There are photographers that I admire greatly who are able to be in a situation where they know going in that it's not completely planned out. And they're really looking for a moment. This happens more with people than things, obviously, because you can have interactions between people, and generally, an iPhone and an iMac are not going to interact too much for you. But the people are, and the great thing about that is that the photographers that I know that do this, put themselves in a situation where they're ready to capture what they've allowed the talent in that particular moment in time and space to use the word, to play with, basically. And they may have specific tasks that you want them to be talking, or both try to get on a bus, or they're both at the beach, or whatever they happen to be doing, but providing them the space for that to happen, and then really watching that talent and observing them and capturing moments where there is interaction. And it's not planned, it's not organized, but he's there to catch the moment, capture it both in time and also in composition and lighting, and all those things come into play. It's organized, but in just a much more kind of, looser way than any kind of product.
Am I describing this incorrectly? I was saying you create the box, but you got a lot of room to rattle in.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe a lot of the things that happen with people, for sure. Especially with kids, for example. I've often described to clients that especially the younger they are, if they're 2 or 3 or 4, to provide the kids space where I can let them literally play or pretend, so that when I'm kind of guide them into an area that I know they're going to react in fun ways that are good for what I'm doing, they're really less aware of me taking the picture and more concentrating on what they're doing, which is ignoring me and having fun or playing or something. Even if there's a specific sort of role that they're in, that works. So, that's a real joy, because you never know what great things can happen. And I think everybody can sort of imagine that for movies or whatever that they see. When they see really good actors and actresses, they have a sense, if they know anything about movies, that, the good directors and good actors, they'll have a couple of takes, and there may be one take that just everything kind of works. The director says, cut, and everybody goes, that was terrific. You couldn't have written down specifically what you wanted them to do, but you let the opportunity happen and then reap the results.
This is a question I don't even know how to form, but it's got to do with spirit, the metaphysical, the ethereal, the non-physical. Your profession is a very physical profession. You're taking photographs involving mechanics, light, the box, and so forth. Mm-hmm. Yet you're trying to capture a thought, I presume. That's why your clients like you. How do you handle that? How do you look for it? How do you capture it? What do you apply to get it?
That's a good question. I think that I always try, every job, whether it's product or people, I really look at it as an opportunity to express qualities, and not just in the photograph, but the way I approach the job, the way I deal with my client, the way I deal with my crew, how I expect them to work, qualities I look for them to express as well. I think joy, a sense of compassion, a sense of diligence. I think when my mind is focused on expressing qualities, I can combine that with a sense of specific lighting, or the talent has to stand this way or that way, as long as that quality comes through. In the end result, if the photograph doesn't express the quality that we all find valuable or desirable, you haven't gotten what you want. I think for me, as long as I'm always thinking that these are qualities that I want to express, like a compass, I always want to be heading north. So maybe I'm turning a little bit northeast or a little bit northwest, but I'm generally heading north, and that's part of what guides me to get the results that I want.
There's a movie that came out. Certain people immensely enjoyed it. It's basically a documentary called Tim's Vermeer. And I thought, gee, a photographer would find that kind of movie fascinating. Could you tell me a little bit about the movie from your perspective, as well as including a little bit for those who've not seen the movie, what its basic thesis is, what it's proven, and how it applies, you think, to your job, to your business?
I've seen the movie. It's a wonderful, wonderful documentary. And the man, Tim, in the movie is a successful video effects editor, engineer. I mean, he's multi-talented and has always been a huge fan of Vermeer, the Dutch painter. I am as well. I mean, he's an amazing painter.
From the 1600s. Right?
From the 1600s. The thing about Tim was that because of the line of work he was in, he looked at those paintings by Vermeer. To him, they looked like video capture. They looked so real that he was just mystified that somebody could paint that well. He spent, I don't know, what was it, 7, 8 years? I don't know, trying to figure out how this could have been accomplished because, in that particular time period, Dutch history, the Dutch were making the best lenses, the best mirrors. Maybe he had some technological advantage. There's no record of Vermeer apprenticing anywhere. On his paintings, there's no sketches that have been changed and like I'll paint it this way. So Tim was hooked. And over the course of the movie, you find out what he feels. And there's no real proof that Vermeer did this, but he, to my satisfaction completely, shows how this happened by literally copying what he thinks Vermeer did. I mean, copying literally to making the exact room that he did one painting, I think it was called The Music Lesson. He created this exact same room dimension, made all the furniture down to the tiniest detail, and made his own paints the same way they made them back in the 1600s. And using this technique that he feels, and I feel, Vermeer used, painted a Vermeer, painted a copy of The Music Lesson. And if you looked at it today, you would be amazed that this was like the third painting this guy had ever done in his life. He's not a painter. Just in terms of a movie and everything, it's fascinating. My wife and I have recommended this to numerous people. How this applies to me, I think one of the things that comes to mind is that this guy in the movie, Tim, has a very childlike outlook to how he views things. He doesn't look at the same thing every day the same way. And he looked at Vermeer's paintings and said, what if there something that was different about how he did this? Which I think is a great attitude, and I endeavor as much as I can to apply that to what I do, to not look at taking a picture as, I'm taking another picture today. But how can I grow? How can I do better? How can I do something that's new, that's fun, that's interesting, that people might enjoy in a different way? And that's part of what I get out of it. Because this is brand new. I mean, Vermeer's been painting how many? 1600s, right? And it isn't until really today that this has been shown to be, this could totally possibly be the way he did this.
Which was a mechanical process.
A mechanical optical method, which is not to take away from just the skill of what he did. I mean, I imagine Vermeer was truly a really good painter to be able to do this in a timely manner, because it took Tim in the movie, I think, 7 months or 9 months to paint the painting. So Vermeer probably worked a little faster, so he must have been a better painter.
I have curiosity about the equipment that you use. First of all, there's a time span of when you started in photography, which I'm not sure, you have to confirm for me. Was it pre-computer?
Oh, definitely pre-computer, yeah. I officially opened my studio where I'm the guy, stopped assisting and everything, January 1st, 1978, so it's 36 years plus now. So.
No computers then. You just had a
No,
camera.
just cameras and film. Sure, Polaroid. Yeah,
Now, of course,
completely digital.
being
For years.
21st century, we're talking about
Mm-hmm.
digital this, digital that, computers and so forth. And
Absolutely.
you're on the cutting edge of that too.
Try to be.
Right. At this point, what is your favorite camera?
That's like saying, what's your favorite tool? A little bit when you're building a house. It's whatever fits the job. There are different cameras for different jobs. If I'm shooting product and I need really large files, it'll be some medium format camera with a medium format back, or it'll be a 35 millimeter kind of size DSLR situation, which are truly phenomenal. And they're finally making lenses for those cameras that are spectacular. I mean, they're just, I don't know if there's another way to describe it. They're just incredible. And there now is a whole new series of cameras that are called mirrorless cameras, which I know of some photographers who basically don't use DSLRs anymore, and they use mirrorless cameras because they're lighter weight, they're smaller, they're easier to pack around, and do the same job, basically. So,
does the manufacturer or the brand identity of the manufacturer of the camera matter anymore, since digital is digital? Or am I saying
no, some cameras and lenses are better than others. That's still the case. I use a Canon to shoot people the other day, and used one of their newer zooms, a 2470, which is so sharp, I can't believe it. It's just, and then somebody else was telling me about the 100 macro, the new 100 macro for the Canon. Incredibly sharp, which is the kind of thing we would see when we were shooting 4.5, and then on medium format backs, you'll see things that are as good as 8x10 used to be. So. But there's there are levels. There are definitely steps. The big ones still are kind of Canon and Nikon and Olympus, and kind of going down the list, Olympus, Inman, Ulta. I don't know who else is out there.
Well,
actually,
I'm curious on one very famous name, and I hear all sorts of
Leica and stuff. Yeah,
Leica. I hear about Rolleiflex, the traditionals. From people, so you won't shoot anything without it, and they go ape over it. What is it about a Rolleiflex or a Rolleiflex? I don't even know how it's pronounced.
Well,
people go crazy for.
Well, I don't know if that camera still exists really at all, but Leica does. Leica as a company still does, but they're digital. There's a Swiss company called Alpa, which also makes a bunch of different things, but they're tremendous optically. Zeiss and still making lenses for different camera systems. Hasselblad makes, actually it's owned by Fuji, makes their lenses. It's really there's nothing made in Sweden anymore, except for the digital backs for Hasselblad, I think. Also Leica, and but they all come to the realization that they have to have some kind of digital product, because film just isn't a viable business model for them anymore. They make tremendous things. I mean, I know, I won't drop his name, but I know an Academy Award-winning DP who was really chomping at the bit to get the latest, Leica camera, because he really loves shooting with. He was excited about getting that. I'm sure it's excellent too. I'm sure it's fantastic. But for most professionals, unless they're in Europe maybe and they can get a better price, or the tax laws are such that make it more viable, some of those things are just too expensive for most people to have.
In terms of the future, what is the future of photography? And I'm not talking about your future. That's another question. I'm talking about the future of photography, given that digital is so prevalent and anyone literally can hold a camera and get thousands of pictures in a minute and say, this is a great shot. What do I need a photographer for?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I've asked that question of myself. That's an excellent question. The technology has changed, as you say, so that now that everybody has a camera, everybody has a phone, has a camera. As a result, it's become obvious that it's not so much having a camera, it's who has the camera and what they do with it. And also the fact that by the sheer number of pictures that are taken, you get some that are truly spectacular because there was somebody in the right place at the right time. There's just so many people with cameras.
Mainly a factor of luck as opposed to professionalism.
Most of the time. I mean, there are people who who are professionals who they spend the time to be in the right place at the right time because they were there for a long time, whether it's a nature photographer or the storm chaser guys who you see all the wonderful pictures of lightning and tornadoes and whatever that they have, but you don't spend the time on the road that they do and sleeping in motels and waiting for storms to develop that don't develop in the weeks and weeks and weeks of that. The same with nature photographers and things like that.
Which brings me to another question about the advantages of an experienced photographer of your caliber versus someone who's maybe technically proficient and fortunate to take lucky shots early on. What's the difference? Why would there be an advantage to work with an experienced photographer who's developed 30 years of talent?
It's a very good question, and oftentimes they don't. Agencies and clients will look at the bottom line and they won't place that value on it. That's a continuing challenge. When you ask the question about where's photography going, more or less, that's one of the things. It's becoming something that I'm reminded of one of the pieces of advice that I got when I first started, which was to keep your overhead low. Good for any business, by the way, but especially for photography these days. The advantage that I try to explain and my rep tries to explain is that you can see by my work what I can accomplish. And I can, tell you without any hesitation that, if you've explained the parameters of a job to me and there's going to be a lot to do in a short period of time, I can tell you honestly if it's possible or not. Somebody who's fairly new, you don't know. As an art buyer or a client, you may not know if they're going to be able to do that. And experienced agencies and art buyers realize that. And the reason they hire somebody with more experience is because they trust them. It's like an insurance policy in a way. I mean, they would love to spend less money, obviously. Who wouldn't? But they also want to get the job done. You can't just show up for, 2 days of shooting and then, gee, we didn't get everything. Well, that doesn't matter. They won't remember the fact that maybe you told them it wasn't possible. They'll just remember you didn't get what you needed. So when we're explaining to clients about things, we try to be clear in terms of what we're understanding, what we're going to do, and make it clear to them what that job is going to require in terms of how fast we need to move, the decisions that have to be made beforehand, the locations we have to choose well beforehand, the talent that has to be there, how everything has to be ready. It's like a big production, even if it's only one day. If there's a lot to do, it's a dance that has to happen. Everything has to happen on cue because you can't, and it doesn't matter what happens. If the heavens open, if the building starts to shake, it doesn't matter. You have to get the shot. The show must go on.
My very last question is, of course, pearls of wisdom for people who are starting, who've decided to go into a commercial or advertising photography career. After they've had their initial blush of luck and therefore maybe success, you need to have the staying power. They need to build the reputation. What nowadays, compared to when you started out, are some of the qualities that you would recommend for younger folk?
I think a couple of things still apply very much. I think the two best pieces of advice I got I still hold, which the first one was do one thing when you're first starting out. People have to have a way to remember who you are. If you do all kinds of different things, from sports photography to fashion to travel they're not going to remember who you are. But if you do one thing, you can build that as something they will remember you for. You can always expand later in your career. The second one I mentioned earlier is to keep your overhead low. A friend of mine once said, more equipment just lets you take a bad picture quicker. And I've always liked that. I mean, I do have a lot of equipment, but I've always remembered that, and I never buy stuff that I'm not using. Use it because I feel it's the right tool for the right job, not just because I have it. So that's what I would say. That and persistence, and that just really always be looking for opportunities to develop yourself visually, to just take better pictures. I mean, however that works for you. How do you, what do you tell a writer that?
I'll write better.
Write better, right? Practice harder. I don't know.
Well, I really appreciate the time you've given me to talk about your career, and thank you.
My pleasure, George. Thanks very much.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting.
It's so interesting. It's interesting.